I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone for being here today and participating. I'm Mickey Kittleson. I'm a professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies, and I'm organizing some professional development activities this semester. Teaching in ASU Sync has required a great deal of time and effort, and it really continues to challenge us in new ways. But the flip side of that is that it's also served as a space for rethinking teaching strategies that may lead to increased student engagement and accessibility. And this is really all the more important to think about during this transformative period in American history. And so far this semester in this Inclusive Teaching Strategies series, we've shared some promising practices and strategies for inclusive images and presentations and bolstering student agency in course assignments. You can find the recordings of the previous sessions on the college's Instruction Junction website, as well as resources suggested during previous sessions. So our half-hour sessions are also intended as a forum for exchange and to start some conversations. So sharing your questions, sharing resources in the chat, it's very much encouraged. And then after the presentation, feel free to raise your hand or to put your questions in the chat, and Kenna will pose those to Terry. So I'm going to turn it over now to the fantastic Kenna Ray, Manager of Instructional Design, and she will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Mickey. Terry Shoemaker is a lecturer in Shippers, the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, and an Americanist scholar of religion focusing on religious changes in contemporary life. His research focuses on how reconversion is lived and its relationship with other domains of life. His first monograph is under contract with the University of Michigan Press, currently titled Faith Over Time. He's also the lead editor of a forthcoming volume examining contemporary spirituality and the millennial generation. Additionally, Terry is the host of the Podcast of the Plague Year, a project in cooperation with the Journal of the Plague Year. I am pleased to turn it over to Terry now for his presentation about making pedagogical choices to expand voices.
Thanks so much, Kenna and Mickey, and thanks to all of you who've put in your efforts to provide these inclusive pedagogy series, and to all those who've been able to present. And thanks for the invitation. To begin with, I thought that I would share, I just want to speak just a little bit about, situate myself a little bit. So I am, as Kenna said, a lecturer in religious studies. And just to be clear on that, it's not necessarily theology, it's more of a phenomenological, sociological, anthropological study of religion. And I end up teaching a lot of larger online courses that do fulfill a lot of gen ed requirements. And so many of my courses online are 150 plus. And so a lot of what I'm going to say today is in that mode, but I think could translate into on-ground in-person courses as well. So to kind of outline and frame what I want to talk about today, I want to talk about some guiding questions that I've had over the last few years in thinking about my pedagogical choices. And that's the way I've really been thinking about it, as choices that I make as an instructor, and then I present it as well to my students as choices that they make as students. For instance, in my 100 level online course, I embed in each module choices that students can make to professionalize themselves. And so this framework of making choices, I think, acknowledges the agency I have as an instructor, but also acknowledges the agency that students have in our courses. And so what I want to share with you today are two items. The one I've been experimenting with in content delivery. The one I want to begin with, though, is an assignment that I've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years, online and in person. I'll share the online mode with you, and some of the outcomes from that assignment. So to begin with, some of my guiding questions over the last couple of years, I've really been thinking about with our courses that fulfill certain gen ed requirements and competencies. How do we better thread our courses across campus together for our students? And what I mean, and I'm sure many of you have encountered this, where students enrolled in your course, say religious studies, but they're an engineering student, and they don't quite understand the connections between what they're pursuing in their academic life and the content that I'm providing in a study of religion. Secondly, another question I had was, how do we give students a space to discuss what I'm calling their emerging expertise related to their academic major and interest? And I want to acknowledge that students are developing an expertise in a topic that potentially has nothing to do with my field. And so how do we create assignments that acknowledges expertise in other fields in our classrooms unrelated or appears unrelated? And then the third, a question that something that I've noticed a lot with our students is that many of our students are what are called digital natives, in the sense that they were born into the technologically advanced world that we live into, with smartphones and internet access. And so what I've seen over the last few years of my teaching is that many of our students don't have a very well developed digital literacy. And what I mean by that is many of our students don't know the difference between an academic journal article versus, say, a New York Times, Washington Post article, versus even a blog posting by someone who's not an expert in our fields. And so these three guiding questions had me thinking about what kind of assignment could I create that would meet many of these objectives with these guiding questions. And so one of the assignments that I've been working with over the last few years that students tend to respond very well to is this assignment that is a journal article, and this is very important. It has to be an article from a reputable news source. It can't be a blog. It can't be an academic journal. I detail what those things are and why they're not acceptable for this particular assignment. But a journal article from, say, the New York Times, Washington Post, the Atlantic, there's so many out there, and many of our students have access to many of these through the ASU library. But they have to find an article that is related to their major or career interest and religion. Now, both the major and religion are broadly defined. So as it pertains to religion, it can be about a specific religious tradition, whether that's Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or whatever. It can be generically about religion. As it pertains to the student's major, it can be broadly the student's major. So if they're a chemistry major, they may think more broadly about science in general. Or if they're an engineering student, it could be, very specifically about engineering. Once they find this article, there's a discussion board prompt where they summarize, but really the meat of the discussion board is for them to think about how this article, the stories or issues that are really developed in the article, pertains to their major and its potential implications for their future career. And so in essence, what I'm asking them to do is to find the intersections of all of our disciplines, and for them to start making the connections of why this gen ed class that they're taking of mine connects with their particular academic interest. By giving them this agency, I think it puts the onus on them to start making the connections of this broader education they're receiving at our institution. Now, there's much more that could be done and some more details of this assignment. This is just kind of the generic skeleton of it. But the next step could be you could have students of either like majors or similar majors or unsimilar majors have a discussion on these articles and the careers that students want to pursue. Since doing this assignment, what I've discovered, and I did do a survey with one course. What I really discovered is that students really take ownership of this particular assignment. because it has to do with what they're interested in, there's a different type of confidence that they approach this assignment with. It does connect the relevancy of this religion course with their major. And I understand that many listening may be wondering what kind of connections with engineering, what kind of connections, say, with biology could be made. And interestingly enough, the engineering students, in my opinion, have done the best job with this particular assignment over and over again. And I can discuss some of those articles that students have found. In the survey that I conducted, 40% of the students of this particular course said they actually discussed the article outside of the classroom with their friends and family, which I think is fantastic. Once we have students committed to talking about the material outside of our classes, I think we've done something very well. And then it does seem to help students develop their knowledge of various forms of online materials. When I first do this, I try to do this assignment a couple of times during the course, and inevitably numerous students will email me, does this count? Because they simply don't understand the differences. And so this helps develop why these sources are different. And then from our perspective, it has wonderfully allowed me as an instructor to discover all kinds of new material. And it allowed me to kind of get out of my specific trajectories of my research. And this has actually led to new lecture topics for me. For instance, I have a lecture that I do about religion and artificial intelligence. And the article itself actually comes from one of the students' articles that they discovered in an online journalistic resource that was absolutely fantastic. So the benefits work both ways in this particular assignment. Now, for the in-person, one of the things I like to do, and I can discuss this more, is that actually a segment of the class will have an article and they come in and they're assigned to discuss the article with smaller groups. It's worked extremely well, and I can discuss that more. Now, secondly, I've been thinking a lot about the way that we deliver our content. I've been reading this book called The Future of the Professions. And in that book, there's a quote there that's really been making me think. And it states this: "Successful professionals of tomorrow will need to embrace a new method of communicating. Not least of these are the channels that are preferred by the recipients of their services." And so over the last few years, I've been trying to think about, outside of the classroom, how do our students absorb knowledge? Now, this may not be good knowledge, as we well know, but how do students absorb knowledge in the everyday? And how can we as instructors meet the preferred channels of our recipients, right? And thinking about this. And so one of the things I've begun doing in my classes, and I started doing this a couple of years ago, was I started thinking about, and I'm sure many of you think about this, how do we, when we're talking about inclusivity, how do we include a diversity of voices in our text? And this is often with our readings, with our videos that we use. And those are great. Many of us choose to include guest lectures, but much of what we still rely on is the monologue of content delivery. And that's me as a single instructor delivering this knowledge to either a classroom of students or an online classroom of students. And this monologue is where I think we kind of get held up sometimes, because I'm not sure that in the everyday, our students typically learn in the everyday through monologues. But what I'm finding and discovering is much of real world knowledge is actually transmitted through dialogue. And initially, this got me thinking more about the Socratic method and how we engage with our students, and that's fine, and we should be doing those things. But for content delivery online, over the last couple of years, I've started actually doing lectures that are interviews with my colleagues. And so within these frames, you can see my colleague Victoria Jackson and my colleague Evan Berry. And this actually started a few years back when I interviewed Victoria Jackson, who is a sport historian and also was a professional athlete herself. And just did this interview because I thought it would be fascinating. And interestingly enough, It was a smaller online class because it was a special topics class. And 50% of the students, without me inquiring or anything else, after that interview, emailed me and said, I just want you to know how perfect that was, and how beneficial that was to me. And it seemed to meet them in a different kind of way. And so the interviewing of our colleagues, I think, is a wonderful way to deliver content, but also to be a bit of an ambassador for our colleagues in other courses. But I've been thinking more and more, how do we take this to the next level? Because this is still me asking questions and it's one person talking. And so something I'm doing in a new class of religion and sports that will be offered in the B session is I invited a colleague of mine at UT Austin, and then one actually a former student of mine, to do what I'm calling a dialogical lecture. And this isn't an interview per se, but this isn't two people doing one lecture, but this is us talking about lecture materials. And so this is a different way of delivery, and it took me a while to think about how this could happen. There's some pre-planning that's required in this, but I'm excited to see how students respond to this. Now, overall, the initial outcomes of me actually doing these interviews and recording the lectures thus far, what I realize is that one, myself and my interlocutors tend to a more easily digestible language as we deliver what we want to say. Like I said, students are pointing these conversations as very beneficial. We end up modeling the dialogical nature of our work. When I think about how I continue to learn, much of what we do at conferences are panel discussions. And much of our work is based on us being able to talk about our work and talk out the specifics of our work. And so we get to model the dialogical nature of our work. It humanizes us as instructors. And then it also, I think, works against the notion that I, as an individual, am a gatekeeper of the knowledge that I have. And so the dialogical nature of it ends up working against this idea that I'm the sage on the stage, and lets our students see that this is a conversation that we're all engaged in. Those are just a couple of the things I'm working on. The second citation there is an article that everyone has access through in the ASU library, and it details the first assignment that I was speaking of. Thank you.
Wow, that's absolutely fantastic, Terry. Thank you for sharing this. And I feel like the information that you delivered is going to keep me thinking for a long time after today. So we would love to have everyone who has a question to either raise their hand or post their question in the chat. And I would like to start by throwing out a question to ask about how some of the strategies that you have mentioned, how they might differ for, you mentioned a small seminar versus a very large class.
Yeah, so, well, let me say the difference is how I do this online and how I do it in person. In a small seminar, it actually works fantastic. And so say that, for instance, I have 25 students in a small seminar. Throughout the semester, I will assign, and students sign up for this early in the semester, but say 5 students know that their day's coming up and they have to work in conjunction with me to find an article, again, about religion in their major. And when they come in that day, they will actually have a group of 4 of their peers and discuss. It actually gives them an opportunity to discuss their expertise in this, right? That yes, they've learned about, and it always follows a specific religious tradition. And so a smaller seminar, the student may have to find a connection between, say, Hinduism and their major, but then they'll come in that day and they'll lead small groups about the topics. And then we have the great thing about it is that when we talk about particular religious traditions, we're talking about them very generally, and the students are bringing very specifics into it. And so with the online courses, with the larger courses, I don't know that the dialogue is as rich as it can be in the smaller seminary course, the seminar courses, I'm sorry. And so that's a distinct difference between the two, but the prompts are kind of the same.
Just to quickly follow up on that and some of the variation, so that some of the larger courses often tend to be lower division courses. And so I was just wondering if that factors in as well, because sometimes it seems to me that in lower division, I need to give a little bit more structure. So finding that balance between student agency, I wondered if you do more of that in the upper division, or maybe I'm on the wrong track with that.
No, you're exactly right. So so say a world religions 100 level class, I do a lot of the work in the prompt of saying, this is what a blog is. Here's an example. Here's an academic journal article. Here's an example. Here's what we're looking for this particular assignment. So there's a lot of work on the front end. And I actually tell students that if you're unsure, feel free to email me a working link to the article. And so again, there's a lot of work on the front end for the instructor in doing this. Now, if I do this assignment, say in a 300 level Religion in America course, the onus is more on the students, and I kind of expect a different level with this. Again, I provide some of the differences between these resources, but I do also expect students to have a little bit more development, one in their majors and minors at this point, because those often require previous courses. And then two, that they would have a better working understanding of how to work this out in their mind. So yes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We have a couple of questions in the chat. I think Kenna is going to help moderate on those.
Yes, and please keep your questions coming. You can unmute or you can post them in the chat and I'll facilitate that. Oops, let me turn on my video. There we go. So Michelle Saint is asking, for the article assignment, how do you grade and respond to students who turn in an inappropriate source?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so, and I see in the chat box, someone else is talking about a rubric. So I have developed a rubric, and the rubric clearly states that, say that this assignment is worth 25 points, that 5 points, a fifth of it, that I credit to them using an appropriate source. Again, they can email me beforehand and ask about the appropriateness of the source. But the rubric actually states, that something to the effect of that this is a relevant journalistic article that meets the prompt. And so what myself and the graders will do is, if a student doesn't submit an appropriate one, we actually in the comments say, this is a blog and this is why it's a blog. Again, if you do this a couple of times during the semester, students get better at this. And so if you're very upfront at the beginning, students do develop this what I call the digital literacy skill of understanding these resources.
Great. And can you share, so in that rubric, can you share some of the criteria? Or if you used a rubric, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. So like the way it's set out is the rubric is something to the effect of appropriate source. They get points for an adequate summary of the article. They get points for making the connections with their majors. I do include grammatical and structural kind of things as well in there. And so, and then there's a part for the rubric as well that they've engaged with other students. And so those are the real points I'm trying to get them to really think about in this particular assignment. Connections, adequacy of the resource are the big two, I think, for what we're doing.
Great. Michelle Miller is asking, in the online class, how do you survey students to discover their major to group them together?
Yeah, so this has been a little bit of a challenge, but one of the things I try to do is when I require the discussion part, is that students will write at the top of their post, right? Students can see all the posts once they submit theirs. Is at the top, students will write in capital letters their major. And so then students can go through each of those articles and see who they need to correspond with. I've done that before. I've actually found that if I tell students you need to engage with someone not in your field, that is actually more beneficial. Because it's, so for instance, I had a student that, I forget what their major was, but they actually wanted to be an airplane pilot in the future. and they found this great article about this particular stewardess who refused to serve somebody, and religion came into play into it. And this student just thought this was the most fascinating thing. But then another student in a service industry field really wanted to engage in that conversation because it met what they were doing as well. And so that's how I typically end up doing it. Now, I can go in, I see Abigail's question there. I can on the roster see students majors that are listed as well. So if there's any confusion, I can go to that as a resource to see what students are majoring in.
And how do you build this assignment? Do you use Canvas discussions or assignments or something else?
Yeah, it's built in as a discussion is what I've used, and this is a carryover from Blackboard discussions, to be honest.
Great. What other questions do you all have?
I can jump in with another question. So in interviewing, do you sort of record those interviews and then maybe, are you able to use them again? And have you ever had the students do the interviews at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with Zoom, the great thing is that we can record, right, the discussion. And so it's been a fantastic resource to do this. I will say I had a student of mine, and we did an independent study where she was looking at skateboarding communities from a spiritual religious lens. Absolutely fantastic project. And so recently, and she graduated. And so I connected with her recently, and together we built the Google Slides. I did the kind of a theoretical framework. She talked about her project, and it's absolutely fascinating. And so one of the things I actually embed in my courses following this particular lecture, I know a lot of students don't quite feel comfortable doing a video recording, but I've been experimenting a lot with students doing audio recordings as a podcast. And there's so many free good resources out there for students to do this. And students have responded very well to podcasting as well. And we'll see how that goes in an upcoming course that I'm doing, where I really put the onus. It's a 300 level, and students, one of the assignments is for them to develop their own podcast as it pertains to religion and sports.
Hi, this is Deanna. I have a question. First of all, Terry, thank you so much. Your students are lucky to have you. This was a great presentation. I'm very interested in the interdisciplinary threading that you're talking about. And I'm wondering if, maybe this is rhetorical, but I'm wondering if there are opportunities to continue this thread for faculty to collaborate with each other. So I don't know if, I'm curious if you've worked with engineering faculty or other types of faculty to continue this thread.
Can I ask, are you speaking specifically about it creating an assignment for students? Maybe,
or even beyond that, maybe. I think, ASU President Crow talks a lot about, this in very high level terms of interdisciplinary sort of activities and that sort of thing. But I haven't seen that in practice necessarily on a higher level. So this is a great, on the assignment level, this is fantastic, but I'm just wondering what the opportunities are for faculty to work with each other from other disciplines.
Yeah, so I can say just a couple of things that I've been able to do. One, because I am in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, which is an interdisciplinary school itself, I feel like we've been able to do quite a bit. For instance, in our school, we developed a sports, culture, and ethics certificate for students, and they have to take courses within philosophy, history, and religious studies, and actually other things. The other thing that I'll say that I was actually able to do, I did my PhD at ASU, and I don't know how many of our participants know, but there's one of the great institutes we have on campus is the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. And so the center sponsors, and I'm sure other centers do this as well, but they'll actually sponsor faculty reading groups. And so as a PhD student, I led a faculty, and it's actually across campuses. We had people coming from multiple campuses, from psychology to sports management to communication to philosophy, history, myself. And it was religion, sports, and violence or something was the topic. And so I think that those opportunities are out there. And the centers we have, I think, are great places to start those conversations.
Well, our half hour always comes to an end way too fast. And so hopefully we can maybe even stay on if anybody else has any questions, but I'd like to formally bring it to an end to be respectful of everyone's busy schedules and to thank you very much, Terry. This has just been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for sharing with us today. And thank you everyone for participating. It's greatly appreciated.
Yeah, thank you all as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Stop recording.